Thanks everyone for joining us for, I don't know, this is our third or fourth meetup for the NYC user group. Our focus is basically supporting everybody from the tri-state area, so New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. And we focus mostly on the Power Platform, but also on Dynamics 365, some Azure, and Pro development. Today, with no introduction required, we have Scott Durow, which will going to present to us or give us an overview of the Powerapps Component Framework, or PCF, and I think show us some secrets in coding and give us some vouchers at the end of it. So I think, Scott, you can go ahead and start presenting, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you very much. You should see my screen. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Good. It's always a good start. So thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, so through a little mix up with the links, and I don't know, hopefully everyone has joined who wants to join by now, but I really thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's really nice to be able to reach out to different groups of people, and I mean, my journey with the Powerapps component framework has gone right back to the early days of the sort of private preview, when it was sort of a really exciting feature. So it's been really nice to be part of the journey with the PCF that has moved through today. And as Eric said, I've got a course out, and I'll be sharing a coupon code, a discount code for that later on. So, but what I'm going to do, firstly, I just introduce myself. So my name's Scott Durow, and I've been a MVP, business applications MVP, since 2013. There's my contact details on Twitter. If there's anything that you want to talk about more on that you see in this presentation, feel free to ask me and reach out. I've also got a YouTube channel which I release videos on various Power Platform related topics. But I do want to hear about you as well. So if you've got a chance, I'll actually paste this in the link in the notes as well, in the chat. So I'd love to hear about what your experience is in terms of if you're using PCF today or you're planning on using PCF. That would be great. We'll take a look at the results later on. So yeah, but I've just recently moved from the UK. Well, I say recently, I mean, it's about 6 months ago now. So I moved from Oxford in the south of England, United Kingdom, over to Vancouver, just outside Vancouver, actually, in a place called the Sunshine Coast. So my wife is from Vancouver, so we're very close to family. Kind of getting used to the size of things over here, because you can see here that the UK in size comparison to North America and Canada is tiny little island. So I'm getting used to the expanses of mass. But one of the things that I wanted to quickly mention is this hashtag ProCode No Code Unite. So if you've not seen that hashtag, and if you've not heard me talking about it before, I'd urge you to search for it on Twitter. Or you'll see lots of people using it. And really, this was something that started about a year ago when I did a presentation with Sarah Lagerquist, actually, at Scottish Summit. And we were talking about the fact that there's all these great no-code tools, but actually sometimes we get so preoccupied with no-code that we kind of miss out the lovely Visual Studio icon from that. So we were suggesting that this hashtag kind of brings both sides together. So less being about one side or the other. We don't have to pick sides. That's the great thing of the Power Platform, is that we can use low code and no code up until the point where we need to extend, and that's where we can start to use pro code. So if you haven't seen that, I've got a blog post about it as well. So yeah, a quick history of PCF then. PCF, Powerapps Component Framework, it was originally built for model-driven apps. And in fact, if you try and add a PCF component to Canvas apps today, you get this rather lovely warning saying that this may contain unsafe code. The skull is my addition, so it's not actually in the dialogue there, but that's basically what it's saying, is that here be dragons, you're using someone else's code, this is not Microsoft code. But interestingly, in model-driven apps, that doesn't exist. You don't get any such warning, because that's really where PCF has come from. So originally we had this the unified interface. Obviously the classic user interface has gone away now, but the PCF was created as a way of extending that model-driven app unified interface, being able to add in functionality in the user interface that really acts in the same way as the rest of the UI does inside the unified interface. And in fact, first-party apps, so the apps, sales and service and marketing and all the other different apps that started to come along built by Microsoft, they're actually using PCF to extend the UI. So it was used internally by Microsoft quite extensively before it was actually came out into even in the early preview. So it was a kind of a testing bed. But then along came Canvas apps, and obviously Canvas apps were a completely separate thing originally, and then we brought both Canvas apps and model-driven apps under the same umbrella and called them Powerapps. And so we had the components inside Canvas apps that you can drag and drop them and things like that. But what Microsoft wanted to do is to have this unified set of controls that worked across both Canvas and model. And that's a journey that has started, over a year ago, 2 years ago. And really we're now starting to see that convergence of both the apps coming together. And PCF is a key part of that convergence. So it's a significant part of Microsoft's strategy. So it's not going to be something that's just going to go away. PCF is going to continue to be invested in, because it's so important into the way in which we can underpin this, as it says in the slide, a rich ecosystem of components. So obviously, if you take it a little bit more back to basics, when we're talking about model-driven apps, and when it first came in, the great thing is that it allowed us to break free outside of iframes. So if you'd ever done any web resource, HTML web resources, you had this kind of this box around your web resource, and you could do HTML in there, and you have quite complicated UIs. But if you wanted to do anything outside of that, you were out of luck. But now what you can see on the right hand side is a PCF control, and you can see that actually it's looking native. It looks, as far as the user is concerned, there is really no boundary. They don't know where the standard model driven apps stop and the PCF starts. It's all kind of part of the same thing. So that was really the really exciting part of a PCF for model driven apps. For Canvas, I did this about a year ago, this tweet, and basically when Canvas PCF first came out, I did this simple PCF control that allowed you to kind of write JavaScript inside a Canvas app, because a lot of people have been trying to do things in Canvas and kind of getting stuck at a point where they couldn't do certain formulas or couldn't do things. So I said, well, actually using PCF, you can write JavaScript inside Canvas apps. It was really a proof of what not to do, and really was trying to make a point that actually PCF is not about trying to add JavaScript to Canvas app. PCF is about allowing us to extend the low code experience by using the pro code components, so that we can facilitate those makers to give them additional functionality. It's not about kind of hijacking Canvas apps and saying, actually, now I'm going to do everything inside HTML and JavaScript. It's about providing extra components. So an example of that is I did a drag and drop component, because if you've done any Canvas app stuff, you'll notice that actually dragging and dropping is actually a little bit difficult, because, well, in fact, there are some hacks using sliders and things like that, but it doesn't really feel like proper drag and drop. Whereas by using PCF, you can actually extend that to create like proper drag and drop that works on a mobile and all that kind of stuff. So it's that extending of the maker experience to provide functionality that's not there natively is what it's so useful for. And then very recently, which is really exciting, we've now got portal PCF components. So the same kind of idea is that you can use obviously the standard functionality that you get with portals, where you can have a form and it renders all the form controls and allows you to capture data or edit data, which is great. Obviously, you can do liquid templates with HTML, but if you still want to use those forms, that kind of metadata driven forms that you get in portals, you can extend that using PCF controls to provide. So, and this is an example that's used from the blog post about it, and you have a slider which is not natively supported originally. So it's all about providing components that then can extend that out of the box behavior, but still making it configurable. And that's really one of the key things. So a little bit of a caveat that Canvas apps and portals PCFs is not GA yet. So that's one thing to bear in mind. In model-driven apps, they are absolutely GA, and they have been GA for a number of months. But originally it was announced in Canvas back in February 2020. There was, for a while, it was saying GA in March 2021, but obviously that date's passed, and I've noticed now actually the general availability has gone to be announced. So I think it's imminent. It's just obviously there's a few things that they haven't to kind of finalize on. But in portals, it's in public preview. It was this month it came out in public preview, but we don't actually have a GA date for that yet. So, it is very much of a journey that we're going on. There's a little table here in some of the differences. I'm not going to go into all of the detail here, but the thing is that there are some quite significant differences in terms of what's supported in model-driven apps, Canvas apps, and portals compared to each other. So, for example, dataset currently is not available in portal. You can only have a single bound dataset in Canvas apps and multiple in model-driven. There's certain data types that are not supported. You can't use the XRM web API yet in Canvas apps and portals. So that's one thing to bear in mind, right? That you've got the same framework, the PCF, the actual PCF framework itself is the same across all these different hosts, but the way in which the host expects the PCF to behave is subtly different. So it is incredibly difficult to create one PCF control that works on all the different hosts. Typically what happens is, unless you're doing something really, really, really simple, like rendering a slider, which is the example that often gets used, anything more complicated than that, you're going to find that potentially you do need to consider the different hosts and maybe even have different versions of a PCF control depending on which host you want to put it on. So that's that's quite an important point, but very much this is a journey, and I think the phrase that really comes to mind here is progress over perfection, right? We started with model-driven apps, and it's about saying, okay, look, this is all the functionality we're unlocking here, and then gradually that framework is rolled out to different hosts, and functionality in that framework is gradually unlocked over time. There haven't been any, to my knowledge, any breaking changes in the PCF framework, which is a pretty significant, and that's a testimony to the team, really. It says, rather than jumping ahead and implementing things that are not finalized and have not stabilized down, they are kind of doing this softly, this progress over perfection kind of gradual approach. And so one thing that is always a consideration is, do you really need a PCF control? Because it seems funny that I'm talking about it, and obviously I've got a course and I've got a lot of content and blogs and videos on PCF. I'm a big proponent of using PCF, but I would say that before you jump in and before you go, right, I absolutely need a whole ton of those in my next project, and I'm going to do all this, and this, the one thing to really truly understand is this total cost of ownership. And this goes back to the hashtag pro code, low code, no code unite. It's about bringing both the makers, the low code makers, and the pro code developers together. But as soon as you go over into PCF, your total cost of ownership does go up quite quickly. because you've got all of the other things that you need to worry about, like, you've got obviously ALM and builds and source code control, and you've got there's a lot more complexity in the things that just to do something that would be very simple using a Canvas app drag and drop kind of thing suddenly becomes a lot more complex as soon as you do using code. So yeah, total cost of ownership is something to keep an eye on there. So this is kind of like a caveat, really, that you should probably apply to everything to do with PCF. But web resources are still a thing. I mean, that's one of the things that web resources are absolutely not going away, and specifically HTML web resources. And one of the things we don't have yet is the concept of an unbound control. So at the moment, you can put a PCF control on a form or in a grid in model-driven apps, but it has to be bound to a specific control. In Canvas, that isn't necessarily such an issue, because there isn't this kind of concept of a form as you get in model-driven apps. But in a model-driven app, the way you have to put a control onto a form is by binding it to a specific field attribute, or binding it to a specific grid or view. And so if you wanted to do an unbound piece of user interface that's just going to be in your sitemap, for example, that's where an HTML web resource at the moment probably is still going to be a thing. Also, things like model-driven form validation, that all that functionality is still needed inside inside JavaScript web resources. So having on-change events that take the value of your attribute and make some decisions and add some validation warnings or add some other calculations on the form. JavaScript web resources are really important for that. So we're not completely losing HTML and JavaScript web resources. They're still there in the background. So it's just enhancing and providing us new versions and new opportunities to extend the user interface. So let's jump in and do a little bit of an overview of how it actually works. So fundamentally, the Powerapps component framework is actually really, really simple. You give the framework, it's got a constructor. You say, okay, if it's, say, for example, a Canvas app or a model-driven app, you say, this is the name of my control. And what it does is it creates an instance of that control, and it's just a JavaScript function that it uses to create the instance of that control. And so once it's created an instance of the PCF control, when the model-driven app form loads, or the Canvas app loads, or the grid in the model-driven app loads, there is a function that has to be implemented by our control called init, which is classic name. And in its responsibility is to do any of the stuff that it needs to preparatory work that's going to do, like maybe call external services or get some metadata or something like that. We don't get given any data yet. It's just there's all that preparatory work. But then as soon as we've got some data, like in Canvas apps, maybe an expression is evaluated, or in the model-driven world, we actually get an attribute value loaded into a form. It then calls another function that has to be implemented by our PCF control, but called update view. And update view's responsibility is to go and grab the data that's been given by the host, and then it goes and creates HTML DOM elements and anything else it needs to do in order to work. And then, of course, you might have a text box or something like that, a drop down, and then you may have an event from those HTML DOM elements. And when something changes that we need to let our host know, and when I say host, I mean Canvas app or model-driven app or portal, what we do is we call a function that's given to us during those calls to the init and the update view, which is called notify output change. So it's kind of like a callback that we're given. We're given this callback. And so we call this callback to notify our host to say that, look, something's changed. So that then the host then responds to that, obviously does all the things it needs to do, updates the form. And in order to get the values that have been updated, it calls another function that we have to implement on a PCF control, which is called get outputs. So notify output change is just a callback. It has no parameters. We don't give any data. We're just saying to our host, something's changed. You need to go and ask me about what's changed. and that's where get outputs happens. Now, you might wonder why there's this sort of separation. Well, the reason that is because actually we could call notify output change lots and lots of times in very quick succession, but it's up to the actual host how often it decides to go and get the latest versions. And so we may call notify output change like 5-6 times, but then actually it's going to sort of debounce that, and it's going to only call the get outputs at the speed that it needs. So really that is the long and short of it. It is really that simple. So what I'm going to do now is sort of take a gear shift and provide some recommendations about PCF controls, because there are so many different ways of doing it, but one of the things that I focus on quite a lot is sort of being, as a developer and as you're writing these things, being as effective and creating the most optimal workflow, so that not only is it quick to write these things, but it's also easier to maintain them. Now, there's lots of ways of writing code, but I believe that maintainable code over time is one of the really key parts to being successful in writing these things. So one of my first recommendations is don't eat yellow snow. Just to see if you're awake. I don't know if anyone's actually listening to me, but yeah, unless it's a lemon flavored snow cone, which are delicious. So, but no, seriously, my first recommendation is to use TypeScript with linting. This is quite an important part. Now, actually, as you'll see, I'm going to do in the second part of this, I'm going to do a demo of actually building a PCF component that's going to implement a lot of these best practices. You'll see it uses TypeScript, and TypeScript is really widely supported now. It's becoming mainstream, and if you use the PCF templates that Microsoft provides, they're all in TypeScript as well. So if you're only using JavaScript today, highly recommended getting up to speed with TypeScript, because one of the great things about TypeScript is you're actually using the greatest and latest versions of the JavaScript before it's actually implemented in any browser. So you can use a lot of the syntax that makes it a lot easier to write code, especially things like async await patterns, before it's actually implemented by all the different browsers. And then when you TypeScript transpile down, it just creates JavaScript that will run in those browsers. So there's just a last caveat there, using linters. And I'm going to show you using linters to just kind of keep your TypeScript clean and consistent. My second recommendation is to use React and MobX. So React is a framework that was actually built by Facebook originally, and it's basically allows you to write. It uses a virtual DOM, and so the virtual DOM is similar to what you might see in HTML DOM in something like jQuery, or just if you're going to create HTML elements inside the DOM in a browser. But the virtual DOM is a lot easier to use because it's stored in memory, and it only changes the actual browser DOM when it needs to do something, because updating the DOM in the browser is actually quite a performance costly operation. So the virtual DOM kind of provides this sort of separation between what we're programming against and actually then React manages what actually is put into HTML. And as you're going to see in the demo, it makes it so much easier to write HTML. So I'd definitely recommend that. And so you can kind of data binding and templating is all kind of handled for you using that React virtual DOM, and you can make components that can be sort of reused and stacked inside that virtual DOM. And again, it means your code is a lot more maintainable over time. And so, React has got this component hierarchy that you end up rendering, which is very similar to something like you might see an HTML set of components, inputs and divs and things like that. It's very similar in that sense, but it's in the virtual DOM, so we can provide a lot more functionality around those components. But the reason I was saying use MobX is because what MobX is a library that allows us to handle state. Because one of the things that people use in React, and if you start to look at React, a lot of people will talk about state and how hard it is to manage state. Well, one of the things about state is if you've got a change in some value, you've got to sort of start to notify your parent, and then that has to go and pass that state down through props to other components, and it has to propagate up and then propagate down, and it makes it very difficult to manage what's going on. And suddenly what you end up with is this sort of component hell Well, what MobX does is allows you to use a pattern called Mvvm, and I'm a real big proponent of Mvvm. It's actually something I used all the way back when I was used to program using Silverlight and then using Windows Presentation Foundation. So if you've ever used any of those kind of tools, you'll know there's XAML, and so Mvvm allows us to store all of our state in our view model, and then when something changes, we notify the view model, and the view model then tells all the other components when something has changed. So it creates this much nicer separation of our business logic, our logic that we're going to implement in our user interface, and then how it's actually rendered inside the UI. So I'm going to show you an example of that. But then the third one is using Fluent UI, and Fluent UI is actually something that is Microsoft's like user interface design language, and actually all of Powerapps is built using Fluent UI, and so it is a design language that has got components that are actually built using React, so that makes it really nice to use in React. And so when you use the Fluent UI, all of your user interface will look exactly the same as the rest of Office 365 and Powerapps. So you start off on this really good footing. And this would be an alternative to using something like Bootstrap or something like that, you know, or Material UI. So Fluent UI is definitely my recommendation there. And because it's built in React, it works perfectly there. There is a little caveat, is that obviously if you're going to create lots and lots of components, they do all bundle their own version of Fluent UI, but that's going to change at some point in the future, I hope, because then we've already got Fluent UI that's actually part of Powerapps itself, so there's no reason why we can't share that library at some point in the future. But for now, the sort of recommendation is to use Fluent UI. And then Fiddler. Fiddler, if you've not used it, is so good because it allows us to debug our code without having to constantly deploy our code to the server. So it allows us to intercept the request to the server and redirect it to a local version of our code, so that we just simply recompile it locally and refresh the page, and it's going to pick up the version. So if you're not using Fiddler, I highly recommend using Fiddler. And then lastly, automated builds. So this is my kind of, you know, top 5, if you like, of recommendations. But automated builds is one of those things that sometimes is an afterthought, but I really highly recommend getting it in there right from the beginning, because it's a lot harder to actually retrospectively add, and it's probably too costly often to retrospectively add. But what it can do is it means that every build you're going to increment the PCF solution version, because one of the things with PCF development is that versioning is really important, because if you don't increment the right solutions version and the right PCF version, then when you deploy your updated version, it's not going to actually replace it. It's not going to be reflected in your deployment. So actually having that auto increment really makes it a lot more repeatable, a lot more less error prone. And you know, also you can do things like making sure that your PCF component is built in release configuration, so it's an optimized build, it's got minified code, you're not bundling loads of stuff that you don't need to make it really performant and streamlined. So I'm going to show an example of actually using a command line tool called Pack, which is Microsoft's Powerapps CLI command line. It is something that was started with PCF, but is now starting to kind of go into more areas, like, you know, for ALM and for other areas of Powerapps development. So it's something you're going to see a lot more of. So I'm going to show you how we use that to create PCF components. So without further ado, I will jump into a demo. And so what I've got here is just an empty folder. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use this pack command, which I was just talking about. So if I just run pack here, you'll see that there's a whole load of options here. You've got admin, org, packaged PCF plugins. So you can see here that it's starting to grow, and this pack tool you're going to see much more of it coming into development against the Powerapps component. Well, Powerapps in general, not just PCF. So PCF is just one sub part of that, but we can do lots of other things for it. So, but in order to create our PCF component, we're going to use the PCF side of pack, and what that gives us is it gives us this init function. So what we can say is pack PCF init, and this takes some parameters. So what first thing is namespace. So just gives us, you know, a unique name, and I'm going to create a calculator, give it the name of my component, and what it also asks is a template. So the template, you can be field or data set. So as I mentioned before, you know, there's these two places. You can put it on a form or on a grid. And what we're going to just do is create a calculator that's just going to do like a simple after-tax calculator, where you might want to use that on your form. So once we've done that, what that does is simply initialize our folder structure. So you can see here we've immediately got a set of various different files that it's created. It's created a TS config for our TypeScript, and it's created a manifest file. So that's you know, the way that pack PCF kind of gets you off and running. But it says there we've got to do npn install, and what npn install does is it installs all the various different libraries that it needs, the dependent libraries, and npn stands for Node Package Manager. So that's kind of a really significant part of a lot of front-end dev when you're working with JavaScript and TypeScript. Everything is delivered through npn. It's kind of like the equivalent of NuGet that you'd use in Visual Studio. So once I've got my my packages installed, what I now need to do is I need to add in linting. Do you remember what I said here? Is we've got an index TS here. So if you remember what I was talking about, the init function for our PCF update view, our get outputs. There's this additional one here is destroy, where you can clear up. So you can see here what it's already done is it's just created those for us. And really that's basically the main part of a PCF component. The other key part of it is this manifest, which basically tells us the properties that we're going to bind to. Remember I was talking about there's no such thing at the moment as an unbound control, because controls need to have properties they can be bound to. And that's what this is doing, is it's telling us what properties we can do, or indeed what data sets and what data types they are. So, but in order to write good TypeScript that's going to be consistent, what we want to do is we want to use something called Eslint. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say npn install Eslint, and I'm going to save that in. And what Eslint does is it allows me to implement certain rules, checks against my code. But I'm also going to install something called Prettier, which is kind of like Eslint, but it's actually looking at much more something like the formatting of my code and how it looks, so I can make it consistent, and it's always going to look the same. So then what I need to do is I need to do this npn install to install some other plugins that I'm going to use part of this Eslint. And I've got a blog post that kind of goes through all these different things that we need. And so what this means is that I very quickly can start writing code, and it will start to tell me about possible problems. But one of the things I do need in my code is I do need to put in something called an Eslint and a Prettier config file. So I'm going to just grab some files that I'm going to paste in here. So what I've done is I've pasted an Eslint file and a Prettier file. And what these are doing is just kind of giving me the rules that I want. So I'm going to do React recommended, Prettier recommended, TypeScript recommended, and a Prettier file which tells me like the trading commas or how I handle new lines and all of that kind of stuff. So these are the sort of real important parts of how you configure these tools. But you can see it very immediately, it started to kind of tell me that actually there's some inconsistencies here, because actually the code that gets generated by these templates doesn't kind of conform to the recommended linting rules. So actually what you can do is you can fix these, and so I can use a shortcut here to fix them. So it's got rid of those, and now what this is doing is it's giving me some warnings. So I can say for example, it's saying here that I've got some parameters that are not used. So you can start to see it's quite strict, and so it really does make sure your code is going to be up to the sort of the standards. And you can see a little bit of inconsistency here, like the public init doesn't have a return, whereas this does have a return. So one of those things will be saying, okay, it's missing a return type. So, you know, I need to provide a return type there. So, you know, it's quite an important part of the way that you're building your code. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to install React. So you can see a lot of the initial setup is about installing components using npn. And what I'm doing here is I'm installing Fluent UI, and I'm installing React and React DOM. So this allows us to use that cool Fluent UI library. And if I was saying about the Mvvm pattern, model view model, and that's using MobX. So I'm going to install the MobX library and MobX React. But I'm also going to install a helper that I use called PCF React as well. And I think one of the things about this code example, which is going to be different to a lot of the other code examples you've seen, is this is really about the experience I've got from professional PCF development. And so what we're going to do now is create a very simple calculator component just to show how this all fits together. So I'm going to create a new folder called Components. And I'm going to create a new file called calculator tsx. So firstly, the TS files are TypeScript, but TSX is a special type of file specifically for React components. And remember, I was talking about this virtual DOM. You can see here that there's these angle brackets here, and this is where I'm starting to put in this kind of HTML type set of components. But actually what it's doing is it's a virtual DOM, and it gets compiled into the real DOM by React. And so I've created this component, but what I need to do is I need to tell my PCF component, this is the index.ts, which has got all these init and update view and get outputs and destroy all that. I need to tell this to use that TSX. And so that's what that PCF React library that I installed does. Is it actually I can basically get rid of all of this and replace it with something much simpler. So what I'm doing is here is I'm inheriting from this standard control React, which is from that PCF React library. And all this is doing is it's saying, okay, using the React DOM, render this calculator component that I've created up here. So let's go into here and see that again. You can see it's calculator component, and this is extending a React component. Now, one thing I would say quickly at this point is that there are lots of different ways of creating React components. You can create function components, you can create class components, you can use hooks. I use class components because I find they're a lot more easier to maintain, especially when we're using this model view, this Mvvm pattern using MobX, and you'll see how that all works. So we'll save all of that away. And so what we can do now, you can come back into our command line here, and what I can do is I can simulate this being deployed using something called npn start watch. And what this does is it will compile my TypeScript, and it kind of creates a local server to serve this up into my browser. So what I've got here is you can see that it's kind of got like a form factor, so I can see I can put tablet, phone, I can put the input parameters that I want to bind to, and it's rendering foo, which is our calculator component. But if I go and change that and just save that, you can see down here at the bottom is it will actually detect a change, and it will actually refresh it in the browser as well. So you know it's pretty cool in that respect. The one thing caveat I would say is that this test harness has only got very limited functionality around the PCF component. It's great for doing like a slider type stuff. Anything you want to do that's more complicated, maybe that calls external web resources, external web API calls, or does much more complex data binding using metadata. it starts to it causes the problem. You'll have to actually deploy it to Powerapps and then use Fiddler, as I was talking about as one of my my kind of top tips there. But you can see here I very quickly got up and running, and you know, using this this React virtual DOM, this is now where I start to add all my functionality. So let's add a little bit of UI here. So what I'm going to do here is going to put in, I've replaced my foo with, this is starting to use, so this has got a stack, and I'm importing this from my Fluent library. I'm also importing the text field from the Fluent library. And I'm putting like, so this is the amount that we're going to calculate the tax, and this is the tax amount, and then this is the amount after tax. So it's, did you see there was a little squiggle there? And I did an auto fix, and do that again. That's just prettier, kind of telling me, okay, look, I need to, the convention is I have a space after that. So I'll do my auto fix and save it away. So the text field is kind of similar as if you were writing HTML. You might put like input, and stack is if you were writing HTML, you might have a div, and you might have a load of CSS to kind of make it properly responsive and all that kind of stuff. But because we're working in Fluent UI, it's this virtual DOM, it's a higher level set of components. All of that complexity is handled behind us, behind the scenes. So when we go back over to our tester here, you can see that it's actually, you know, it's rendered it in, you know, a kind of a much more formatted way. And you can see that it's, you know, it kind of starts to look at that. We haven't done any CSS, we haven't done anything like that, but it's all styled. But also the other thing is it's using Fluent UI. It's very responsive, and it's got a lot of you know, accessible stuff. But the next thing we need to do is obviously we need to say that we're going to bind this to a particular property. So I'm going to go into here and I'm going to say, right, bind this. I'm going to bind this to a currency field, which is amount after tax. So we would use this to bind to a currency field on a model-driven form, and we're going to say it's required and it's bound. You can also have input values as well, which we won't go into, but bound, which means it's a two-way. So I can take the value in from the model-driven app, and I can also update it. And that's what this calculator is going to do. But we need to actually go and add this functionality in. Interestingly, we do need to obviously define, you know, what our tax percentage is and all that kind of stuff, all the logic behind that. Now, if you were just writing pure React components, you'd start to do that inside this component, and that gets really complicated very, very quickly. And that's why I say to use Mvvm. And so we can create a view models directory here, and I'm going to go and create a new file, and I'm going to call this tax calculator view model, and I'm going to call it the TS. So this is TypeScript. This is not TSX. This is TypeScript, just pure TypeScript. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a whole load of logic here. But you'll see that it's very pure logic. Okay, so here we go. Tax calculator view model. And we've got some events here on change amount. So when the amount's changed, it goes and recalculates the value after tax. When the tax changed, it changes the value after tax. When the amount changes, it calculates the amount using the current tax. So it's a kind of a two-way thing. You know, I can put in the amount, or I can put in the tax, or I can put in the total amount, and it will calculate those other two values. But what this has also got is it's got a flag in here called calculate mode. So what I'm saying is that I'm going to display a value, and then when I click on an icon, I want that to then suddenly toggle my calculate mode, and it goes into this this special view, and then I can accept my values. So I've got another function here to say accept, and that's going to turn calculate mode off. And what this is doing is it's using my PCF React library just to simply set parameters. So I've kind of got a helper here that makes it so much easier to actually write your values back. And what this effectively does under the covers is calls that notify notify callback, which then tells model-driven apps to go and pull my latest value. But what you'll notice is there's this special thing at the top here, because what we've just looked at is basically a very simple class, just with some events and some values with calculations. But where the real special stuff comes here is this make observable, because what this does is actually this tells MobX that this is a special view model that it can bind values to. And so what this means is that I can now create some unit tests. If I wanted to, I can go and create unit tests to test all this functionality. I don't need the user interface at all. This is purely code that I can test. And all I need to do is make an instance of tax calculator view model, set some values, and check that certain values are set when I call certain events. And so we can, this is a very simple example, but for very complex pieces of user interface, you want to be able to test your functionality without having to worry about buttons and bindings in React and stuff like that. So one thing I do need to do is I need to now provide this view model to my user interface. I need to bind it, right? So in order to bind that, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go and grab create an instance of my view model, and what I'm doing here is I'm using the service provider pattern, and so what this is doing is it's going to register my view model in the service provider, and then it passes my service provider to my calculator component. So in my calculator component, if we go into this, rather than just this really simple kind of piece of logic here, what I can do here is I want to accept my service provider. So let's go, and what I'm doing here is just importing these values from my PCF, and I'm going to import those from the tax calculator. And so what this is doing is it's saying this component accepts the service provider. And then all I need to do is grab the view model from my service provider, and now I can bind those text fields that I had before to my amount that I'm grabbing from my view model, my tax, and my value after tax. But also I can bind these events on my text field, see on change amount, tax, on change value after tax. And then what I've got is I've got these two buttons here, which I need to import from React. And what this does is allows me to accept the value. So there's got a little extra bit here to say I've got an icon button to say calculate, and on click it goes and calls the view model on calculate, which flips it over into the calculate mode. And then once I've done my various different calculations, I can say accept, and that flips it back again to just displaying the calculated value. So you can see here that the user interface is a React piece of functionality, and it's got none of the calculations, none of the logic. All the logic is completely 100% encapsulated in that view model, and this is purely just showing how it's going to be rendered. And I find keeping that separation of concerns really useful. The great thing about using a single view model for state is I can actually separate this up into subcomponents and use the same service provider and get the view model. I don't have to worry about state binding in my React components. I'm not using React state at all. I'm using MobX and my view model to manage it, which makes it so much easier to refactor. The only little thing I need to do to tell MobX that this is a special component that responds to any data binding changes, I need to tell it that it's an observer. I'm observing my view model. That's the key thing here. So once I've done that, the only last thing I need to do is I'm using some icons here. So this is a Fluent UI icon button, which is really cool because I can just give it a calculator icon, but I need to register that icon. So there's this initialize icon, and I can grab that in from my icons in React. So if I save that away, then what we should find is that this now change is detected, and I've not got any problems here. So when I go over into my my tester here, you can see here we've got our little calculator button, and if I flick that over, and I've now got the ability, I can go and change my amount, and you can see that the amount after tax is automatically updating because my view model is doing the calculation, and because MobX is there with the view model binding, I've set it as an observer, it's now observing and it's now automatically updating. So it's like magic. It's not nothing's happening. If I go into that component, the calculator component, and I commented this out, then none of that functionality would work. I'm clicking the icon, but nothing's happened because the view model is being told about the change, but because we haven't registered as an observer, it's not listening to changes in the view model. So it's an observable pattern, which is hugely powerful. And so once I've done that, really the only last step would be to call. There's another in the pack CLI. There is another pack PCF, which is push. And what pack PCF push does allows me to push it into model-driven apps quickly in order for me to test it. I would not be doing this to actually do any kind of production deployments. This is purely from actually testing it inside model-driven apps. And what it does there is it goes and creates a solution, a temporary solution, and it registers our component, and then it pushes it through, and so that we can then go and add it onto a form. And just for kind of the speed, I've actually already got a version of this deployed. So what you can see here is a model-driven app, and it is doing the same kind of functionalities we've just seen there. So you can see it looks just exactly the same as the rest of the functionality around it. And these icons are Fluent UI icons. They're very consistent with the rest of model-driven apps. And really, as if a user was concerned, they really wouldn't know any different. That would just look exactly the same as as any other component that you might see. And that's no surprise, because it's using effectively exactly the same tech that all of the rest of the Fluent UI is using, the rest of Powerapps is using. So that is the kind of a real whistle-stop tour of those kind of key best practices. I didn't show Fiddler because that we just simply don't have time to do that. But in my course, I go through all of these kind of in a lot more depth and really go into a deep dive and see how they're working behind the scenes, and how that functionality can be extended, and how you can go and write unit tests using Jest, and not only unit tests but also integration tests, how you can call the web API, how you can use Fiddler, how you can integrate all this into your Azure DevOps pipeline. A whole ton of stuff. And so there's a special promo here. If you want to use that promo code, you can get a 20% discount into the course. I do offer multi-seat discounts if you want to have multiple people in your organization registered. But the code that we just went through, if you follow this link here, this bit.ly PCF React demo, all of the code that I just showed is actually in that GitHub repository. There's also some, if you want to start on the kind of the basics, the free Microsoft Learn content is really good to kind of cover all of that stuff about how you use pack PCF init and how you wire up your DOM. It doesn't really cover all of the stuff about React. Benedict's also got a really good guide in GitHub where he kind of shows various different sessions, various different iterations, creating a little bit more complex stuff than the Microsoft Learn does stuff, and that's free. But again, like I said, the stuff I've shown you here, what I've tried to give you is a real kind of taster for the stuff that you wouldn't normally see in your normal demos that you get on PCF. It's much more about a focus on maintainability and on creating professional components that are going to have as lowest total cost of ownership as possible, but while still kind of delivering that kind of benefit that you get with PCF components. I do actually have a load of ideas that I've submitted in Powerapps. If you follow this link here for PCF vote on this bit.ly, I'd appreciate some votes to vote up so that the product team will listen and and kind of act on some of those things. But yeah, I like I said at the beginning, if you want to have any questions that we can't cover now, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. But how about if anyone's got any questions, we've got a little bit of time where we can have a bit of an open discussion.
Yes, Scott, there was a question on chat by Akhil.
Yeah.
The question is, would there be performance implications if more than a certain number of PCFs are used on a form? Yeah,
that's actually a very good question, and obviously, if you've got the more stuff you have on a form, there is always going to be performance implications, right? If you have like hundreds of fields, your form is going to load slower than if you had 10 fields. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that it's, in that sense, it's nothing to do with PCF. The other thing is that actually gradually Microsoft are moving all of their kind of standard controls over to PCF. So PCF is not like a kind of an additional thing that is just for customizations. The first-party apps themselves and the framework itself, the Powerapps framework itself, is using PCF to deliver a lot of this functionality. Now, if you've used Powerapps, Dataverse in Teams, you might have noticed that Canvas app components look a bit different, and the reason they're looking different is they're actually using Fluent UI. Now, I mentioned before that the one thing about Fluent UI is that Powerapps uses itself, but when you use Fluent UI, what's happening is when this is being compiled, it is actually creating a bundle JavaScript, and inside that bundle, it is actually going to be putting in the Fluent UI. So if you've got one control that's used many times on your form, it will only load that bundle once. But if you've got many different controls that are all using Fluent UI, it's going to load multiple versions of Fluent UI, and it's not huge, but it will have an impact. Now, that's one of the things that is hopefully going to happen, is that at the moment, the best practice is to use Fluent UI, and then in line with that, what will happen is that we'll be able to unlock a what's being called a virtual control, so that we'll be able to use the Fluent UI library that's part of Powerapps itself. And actually, it's interesting because if you look in node modules, and if you go into the PCF control area of that, which is PCF scripts, if you look in the feature flags JSON, you'll notice a lot of stuff that is off. And it's quite interesting. You can see the sort of roadmap that is happening in PCF. This is the feature flags that control stuff that is not released yet. Those of you that have seen stuff online about using lookup bindings, which is not technically supported, there is actually a flag here which you can turn on, which makes it work, even though it's not supported. But another one, there is this PCF virtual control. Again, it's off. So this kind of gives you a view into the future. So my best practice would be to use Fluent UI, and but be wary of the fact that it is bundling. If you've got many different controls all being loaded on the same form, then it may cause you a problem. But if you've just got maybe one or two, and even if they use multiple times, it's only going to load that bundle once. So that was a long answer, but hopefully kind of gave you a bit of information. Does that answer your question?
Akhil, if you want to unmute yourself, you can speak. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Anyone wants to ask any questions? Scott is available to take any questions on PCF.
Hey, Arun here. Scott, actually something came to my mind. I was reading some blog post or something. We have an option to extend, let's say, Dynamics CRM out-of-box grid, right? Yeah. We can take that control and extend there onwards using PCF. What is the roadmap for that?
Right, yeah. So that's a kind of a topic that comes up a lot, because the expectation is that if you've already got functionality in a grid, a user's expectation is that if you have got a grid, then you've got sort, you've got filtering, all of that kind of stuff, dragging the various different columns around. Well, your users are going to expect, if you create your own custom grid, you're going to expect the same kind of level of functionality. And at the moment, unfortunately, you can't extend the out of the box grids. You can't use that as a starting point. You are somewhat starting completely afresh. However, the only caveat to that would be, as I would say, is that if we load, if we go to do a search for the Fluent UI, then if you look at the details list, so if we go into the web controls, what we can see here is that it actually gives us a lot of the information, a lot of the user interface already there for us. So the Fluent UI kind of gives us that springboard up into a lot of that, like resizing grid columns. I don't know why this is not loading. I really don't know why that is loading. Let's try in a different browser. Maybe it's taking exception to that. Let's grab it in there. So there we go. Yeah, so you can see here, this is the Fluent UI, and you've got lots of functionality that you would kind of expect, being able to, compact, and you can have shimmering when you're loading it, and you can have like drag and drop of different items, and moving columns. So there's a lot of functionality that you get with that, but you are actually going to have to implement your own kind of paging and your own filtering and all that kind of stuff. Now, I would hope at some point, maybe there will be a set of components that sort of give you that starting point, all of that functionality there for you, and you can extend it. But that's not the case at the moment. But you do get that bootstrapping up with the Fluent UI. Does that make sense, Aaron?
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks, Scott.
And if you come to this Fluent UI page, it's funny because you just look at the page and it's like, oh, this all looks very familiar. It's all basically looks exactly the same as Office 365 and Canvas apps and Powerapps, because it is using the same functionality. And I think it is really, amazing because it gives you so much functionality right from the off. Especially when you use that Mvvm structure with MobX I was just showing you, where you can separate out the binding to your business logic separate to the user interface. As I showed in that kind of quick demo, these things doesn't require very much code for you to get up some quite complicated functionality.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Sure, let me take my hands dirty on that one. Cool. Okay, thank you, Scott. Any more questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up.
Scott, I do have one question. You mentioned at the beginning when you load a PCF control into a Canvas app, you get that funky arrow without the skull.
Yes.
Are the users going to experience that every time they load the app?
No, it only happens when you're in the maker portal. So it's basically telling the maker of the app that they shouldn't trust this code. As far as once you publish it, it's up to you. Then it's your responsibility to make sure that what you've published is okay.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe it'll go away, or maybe I don't know. Maybe it'll appear in model driven apps. I don't know, but for now it's just there.
We never know.
Anyone else got any other questions?
Guess not. Okay, thank you everyone for attending this session.
Sorry, hold on here 1 second.
Yep.
Well, first of all, thanks, Scott. This was amazing. We know where the roadmap is. I would like to just share a couple of short notices. So So we already saw this. So anybody who's interested, May 4th, there's the Microsoft Business Application Summit. Just like every year, it's coming up. So register, since this is still a virtual event. I don't think there is a limitation of any space. But I think last EMBA Summit, there was a number that nobody ever expected. And then one announcement about the user group. So Microsoft recently, this is currently in public preview, but as part of the Power Platform or Powerapps, there's different user groups. Our user groups is going to move eventually, I don't know exactly, but once this shifts from public preview to the Microsoft platform, we will send notifications, but for moving forward and for the next event, we'll start publishing our events in both places. And probably within the next few months, we'll just shift everything onto the Microsoft user group or Microsoft hosted user group. And then last thing, our next event, we still don't have the exact date and presenter, but we will have our next event sometime in mid-May, and we'll publish it and notify everybody the same way. So that's for the announcements. Thanks again, Scott. This was really great.
Hey, you're very welcome. And just if you flip back to that other slide you were just on, they're using Fluent UI on that on the on the user groups page.
Oh, okay.
So you can see there that it's all Fluent UI styled stuff. So.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you,
Thanks,
Scott.
everybody.
Thanks everyone
Appreciate it.
for coming. Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott.